A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. Juliet Smith from our sister station in Eugene spoke with one of the professors to learn more.
There is a row of shallow caves carved into a cliff face in south-central Oregon, about 220 miles southeast of Eugene, sitting on the ancient shoreline of a lake that dried up thousands of years ago. They are called the Paisley Caves. For most of the 20th century, they were treated as a footnote, a curiosity visited briefly in the 1930s and then largely forgotten. Nobody thought there was anything down there worth turning the field upside down for. They were wrong. When a University of Oregon team led by senior archaeologist Dennis Jenkins began digging in earnest, they were not looking for a revolution. They were looking for evidence. What they pulled out of the dry, compressed earth of those caves did not just challenge the accepted story of how and when humans first arrived in the Americas. It broke it open. And what followed, at a second Oregon site, then in New Mexico, and then in a series of other locations across the continent, formed a pattern so dense and so consistent that the old story could not absorb it. The old story had to go. This is what Oregon uncovered, and why the scientific world is still reckoning with it. The Paisley Caves are westward-facing, wave-cut rock shelters sitting on the highest ancient shoreline of what was once called pluvial Lake Chewaucan. During the Ice Age, when the climate was wetter and colder, that lake filled the basin. When it shrank and eventually disappeared, it left behind these shallow caves, dry and sealed, sitting above the vanished waterline like a row of abandoned windows in a cliff. The desert air of the Oregon High Plateau did something that no laboratory can replicate. It preserved organic material that would have rotted away anywhere else within a season. Bone, plant fiber, and other fragile matter survived in those caves for thousands of years simply because nothing wet ever reached them. That dryness is the reason the discovery was possible at all. And the discovery itself was not a spear point or a carved artifact. It was something far more humble and far more unambiguous. It was human coprolites, preserved ancient human feces, dried hard and sitting exactly where a person had left them an unimaginable span of time ago. The research team extracted DNA from these specimens and submitted them for analysis. The mitochondrial DNA recovered belonged to haplogroups A2 and B2, which are among the founding genetic lineages of Native American populations in the Western Hemisphere. This was not the genetic signature of some failed, isolated migration that wandered in and vanished without descendants. These were the direct ancestral genetic lines of indigenous people living on this continent today. A bloodline running in an unbroken thread from the floor of a cave in Oregon to the present moment. Then came the dating. The method used was accelerator mass spectrometry, which measures the age of the organic material itself rather than the sediment surrounding it. That distinction matters enormously. The usual challenge to an unexpectedly old date is that the object may have slipped down through the layers, or that sediment was disturbed at some point. Accelerator mass spectrometry bypasses that objection entirely. It dates the thing you are holding on its own terms. The result that came back from multiple rounds of testing placed the coprolites at approximately 14,300 to 14,400 years before the present in radiocarbon years, calibrated to around 14,400 years before present. That is more than 1,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have set foot anywhere on the continent. 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, outside the small town of Riley in Harney County, eastern Oregon, is a place called the Rimrock Draw rock shelter. It is a basalt overhang roughly 3 meters deep and 20 meters long, sitting above a dry, ancient stream channel on land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Dr. Patrick O'Grady of the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History has been excavating it since 2011 in partnership with the BLM through an official agreement. Rimrock Draw is the kind of site that does not hand over its secrets quickly. For years, the team worked through the layers, finding obsidian flakes, scattered lithic material, and hints of something deeper without any single dramatic breakthrough. The archaeology of this place proceeded the way most real archaeology does, slowly, carefully, with no guarantee that the patience would ever be rewarded. Then, in 2012, the team found a layer of white ash buried in the sediment. Geologists matched that ash to a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens. That eruption has been dated to more than 15,000 years ago, more precisely, to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 calibrated years before present. The ash layer is not a sample that can be argued with. It is not an artifact that could have moved through the soil. It is a geological event, a volcano that erupted on a specific date, drifted its ash across the landscape, and sealed everything beneath it under a chemically identifiable lid. The rule of the site became simple and absolute. Anything found below that ash layer predates the eruption. Full stop. What the team pulled out from beneath that lid was extraordinary. Fragments of tooth enamel from Ice Age animals, including camelops, the extinct North American camel, and Bison antiquus, a larger and heavier ancestor of the modern American bison. These were creatures of a vanished world, megafauna of the late Pleistocene that had been gone for thousands of years. Their remains were sitting beneath the ash layer, sealed there since before the volcano erupted. And below the animal teeth, 10 centimeters deeper, meaning older, was a stone tool. 2 of them, in fact, orange agate or chalcedony scrapers. One, recovered in 2012, had preserved bison blood residue on it. The other, found in 2015, was buried even deeper in the ash. These tools showed deliberate, skilled craftsmanship, a multi-purpose design with edges worked for cutting, scraping, and other tasks. The wear on them was real and old. Radiocarbon dating performed in 2018 and again in 2023 by Dr. Thomas Stafford of Stafford Research and Dr. John Southen of the University of California, Irvine, returned a date of approximately 18,250 years before present for the camel and bison enamel. Stafford ran multiple tests across different portions of the enamel over 5 years. Each time, the result came back to the same window. The site is basalt rather than limestone, which ruled out the geological contamination that critics sometimes raise at other sites. The volcanic ash that protected the bones also protected the integrity of the dates. Oregon did not discover a new problem. It confirmed an old one that the field had been successfully ignoring for 4 decades. In 1955, a farmer and local historian named Albert Miller was hiking across his property in western Pennsylvania when he noticed a groundhog burrow in a cliffside overlooking Cross Creek, a tributary of the Ohio River about 7 miles upstream from the Ohio. Sticking out of the edges of that burrow were flint flakes and burnt bone. Miller recognized them as artifacts but held back from reporting his find for years, not wanting to attract vandals or attention he couldn't manage. When he finally connected with archaeologist James Adavajo in 1973, Adavajo had no idea what he was walking into. The site, which became known as Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, near Vela in Washington County, sits high in a sandstone bluff beneath a natural overhanging ledge. It is sheltered, dry, well-ventilated, and positioned above a freshwater source. Adavajo later described it as a Paleolithic holiday and precisely the kind of comfortable, protected stopping point that travelers of any era would have been drawn to without a second thought. What Adavajo and his University of Pittsburgh team found when they dug down through the layers was a continuous record of human occupation stretching from the prehistoric past to the 18th century, the longest such sequence of unbroken habitation yet identified in North America. And at the bottom of those layers, something that should not have existed. Radiocarbon dates on charcoal from hearths, on a cut piece of bark that may have been a basket fragment, on other organic materials from the deepest strata, returned ages of 16,000 years before present, in some cases, potentially as old as 19,000 years. The tools found at those depths, smooth lanceolate points with no fluting, small prismatic blade flakes, looked nothing like Clovis technology. They were something older, something distinct, using techniques that according to the textbook had not yet been invented. Adavajo published the results. The response from much of the field was fierce. Some colleagues accused him of contaminated samples, arguing that coal-bearing geology in the watershed might have introduced ancient carbon into his dates and made them appear older than they were. Others chose a different strategy and simply declined to engage with the paper at all, which in science is its own form of dismissal. The pressure was sustained and deliberate. For years, Adavajo held the position alone, defending dates that pointed to a pre-Clovis world while majority of the field looked the other way. 700 miles south of the Paisley Caves, in the gypsum dune fields of White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, the argument moved from bones and tools to something more immediate and harder to dismiss: footprints. In 2009, researchers crossing the dried bed of an ancient lake called Lake Otero noticed impressions in the pale, hard ground. They were not faint outlines or ambiguous marks. They were clear, detailed human footprints. 61 of them. The toes are visible. The arch is visible. Some belong to children. Others belong to adults moving quickly. This is not the kind of evidence that requires interpretation or inference. It is a group of people, children among them, walking along the edge of an Ice Age lake on an ordinary day, pressing their feet into wet mud that dried and hardened and was buried under sediment and preserved for thousands of years until someone crossed the same ground again. In 2021, a research team published dates for those footprints in the journal Science. Radiocarbon dating of seeds from the aquatic plant Ruppia serosa, found in the sediment layers directly above and below the prints, placed them between 21,000 and 23,000 years before present. The implications were staggering. At 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, the planet was at or near the height of the last glacial maximum, the coldest point of the last ice age. The corridor through the interior of North America that Clovis hunters were supposed to have walked through from Asia was blocked by ice sheets that had not yet begun to melt. The door was not open, and yet people were already in New Mexico. Critics raised a legitimate methodological question. Aquatic plants like Ruppia serosa can absorb ancient dissolved carbon from groundwater, which could in theory make radiocarbon dates appear older than they truly are. It was the kind of objection that science is supposed to engage with seriously, and it was engaged with seriously. A follow-up study published in Science in 2023 used two new independent dating approaches, conifer pollen, which does not absorb groundwater carbon, and optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains, and returned the same age range. Then, in June 2025, a third study published in Science Advances, led by University of Arizona archaeologist and geologist Vance Holliday, radiocarbon dated mud cores from the lake bed itself, sending samples to two completely independent laboratories. Both came back with the same result, 20,700 to 22,400 years before present. There are now a total of 55 radiocarbon-dated samples from seeds, pollen, and mud, all clustering in the same window, all pointing to the same conclusion. Jason Windingstad, a doctoral student who worked with Holliday on the most recent fieldwork, described seeing the prints for the first time as a profound moment. He said it basically contradicts everything that had been taught about the peopling of North America. Holliday himself noted that people living by their tools and weapons did not casually leave them behind. Hunter-gatherers in unfamiliar territory kept their implements close because replacing them required the right raw materials, which might be far away. The absence of tools at the site does not undercut the footprints. It is consistent with people passing through. People who were already here, already moving, already familiar enough with this landscape to walk a shoreline with their children beside them. Once you accept that people were in Oregon 14,000 to 18,000 years ago, in Pennsylvania potentially 16,000 to 19,000 years ago, and in New Mexico 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, the question changes. The question is no longer whether the textbook was wrong about the timeline. The question is where these people came from and how they got here. Because the old answer, a single land bridge crossing from Siberia, was designed to explain a single wave of migration arriving roughly 13,000 years ago. It cannot explain people in New Mexico at the height of the last ice age, when the interior corridor was closed. Researchers tracing specific mitochondrial lineages in ancient DNA have identified what appears to be at least two distinct waves of migration. One, arriving around 15,000 years ago or slightly earlier, is consistent with the Clovis-era populations and may have used the overland corridor when it opened. But another, earlier wave appears to have traveled a different route. The genetic evidence points toward the northern coast of China and then along the Pacific coastline, moving northward through Japan and then across the North Pacific, not as a single dramatic crossing but as a gradual generational drift along the coastline, following marine resources, moving from camp to camp over many generations, never necessarily far from land. This model is supported by something that once seemed to rule out any maritime migration, the assumption that ancient people could not cross open water. That assumption has collapsed. Research on the Greek island of Crete has produced stone tools at multiple sites dated between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, at a time when Crete was already an island and had been for millions of years. Someone crossed the Mediterranean to reach it, using watercraft, long before modern humans are thought to have left Africa. The idea that ancient people were incapable of building and using seaworthy vessels is not supported by the evidence. It was an assumption built on absence, and absence is not the same as impossibility. The Western stem tradition tools found at both Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw fit the coastal migration model better than they fit the overland Beringia model. They look nothing like Clovis tools, and similar stoneworking traditions have been documented along the Asian Pacific coast. Tools do not reinvent themselves identically thousands of miles apart without a connection. A shared technique is a trail, and that trail runs from the coast of eastern Asia westward across the North Pacific and down through Oregon. The Clovis hunters, in this revised picture, were not the pioneers standing at the front of the American story. They were latecomers walking overland into a continent that had already been reached, explored, and settled by people who came a completely different way, using a completely different route, thousands of years earlier. The museum dioramas have the story exactly backward. Step back and look at what these two Oregon sites accomplished together. Paisley Caves provided a date and a genetic identity. The accelerator mass spectrometry dated the organic material directly, bypassing the contamination objections. The mitochondrial DNA connected these ancient people to living Native American lineages, not a dead-end migration, but a direct ancestral line still present on this continent. Rimrock Draw provided something different, a geological lock on the timeline. A volcanic ash layer from a dated Mount St. Helens eruption, sealing everything beneath it like a lid, placing human tools and Ice Age animal remains in a stratum older than 15,000 years and dating the animal enamel to approximately 18,250 years before present. One site gave the field biological proof. The other gave it geological proof. Neither one can be explained away by the usual objections. What Oregon did, essentially, was make it impossible to keep looking away. Meadowcroft had been saying this for 40 years. White Sands would say it again. But Oregon was the turning point, the moment when the evidence became too dense, too well documented, and too methodologically rigorous to dismiss without simply choosing not to engage. And the people this evidence describes were not marginal, peripheral figures at the edge of the human story. The DNA from Paisley connects directly to indigenous communities that exist right now. The line from a cave in the Oregon high desert to the present day is not broken. Those ancient people sheltered in those caves ate the fish and grouse and giant bison that the surrounding landscape offered, left behind the biological traces of their presence, and were survived by their descendants, who survived the Ice Age, the megafauna extinctions, the melting of the glaciers, and thousands of years of upheaval, and are still here. There is one more piece of evidence that sits at the far edge of this picture, a data point so extreme that most of the field simply refuses to engage with it. In 1992, construction work near San Diego, California, struck bone during a road-cutting operation. Paleontologists were called in and uncovered the partial remains of a mastodon, an elephant-like Ice Age creature that went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. But the bones showed spiral fractures, the specific kind of break that only occurs in fresh bone with living marrow inside. Fossilized, dry bone shatters. Fresh bone twists and spirals as it breaks. Someone had cracked these bones open while the animal was recently dead, almost certainly to extract the marrow. Nearby were large cobblestones, hammerstones, and anvil stones that geological analysis confirmed had not been carried there by water. They were brought there by whoever butchered the animal. The site, now known as the Cheruti Mastodon Site, was published in the journal Nature in 2017. Uranium-thorium dating of the bone returned an age of approximately 130,700 years before present. That number is not a variation on the Paisley or Rimrock or White Sands dates. It is not a modest pushback of the timeline. It is a complete rupture with everything the field thought it understood about when any human or human ancestor arrived in the Western Hemisphere. Modern humans were not dispersing out of Africa 130,000 years ago in any model that currently exists. Whoever broke those bones in California was not Homo sapiens in the sense we usually mean. It was something else, some other branch of the human family, from a chapter of prehistory that has no place yet in any accepted migration map of the Americas. The Cheruti Mastodon Site has not been disproven. It has been ignored, questioned, and set aside, not because the dating methodology is flawed, but because the implications are too large for the field to process without dismantling nearly everything built around the study of early Americans. That is not a scientific response. It is an institutional one. The question it raises remains open, unanswered, and uncomfortable. Who was in California 130,700 years ago, and where did they go? What Oregon did was not simply add a few thousand years to an established timeline. It broke the paradigm that had organized American archaeology for most of the 20th century and forced the field to reckon with a picture far more complex, far older, and far more geographically diverse than the textbook ever imagined. Multiple waves of migration, at least one of them maritime, arriving in the Americas from different directions and at different times, carrying different technologies and leaving different genetic signatures, living alongside Ice Age megafauna and landscapes that no longer exist. The people who sheltered in the Paisley caves were here before Clovis by 1,000 years. The people at Rimrock Draw were here before Clovis by several thousand years more. The people who walked the shores of Lake Otero at White Sands were here at the height of the last ice age, when the continent was sealed from Asia by ice. And someone or something cracked mastodon bones for their marrow in California 130,700 years ago. Each of those facts sits on real evidence, documented by real researchers, published in peer-reviewed journals. The story of the first Americans is not a settled question. It is an open investigation, and the ground keeps giving up new witnesses. Somewhere out there right now, in sediment that has not yet been touched, in a cave that has not yet been found, in a dry desert basin or a riverbank or a volcanic ash layer somewhere in the American West, the next piece is already waiting. The next date, the next tool, the next set of footprints pressed into ancient mud by someone who had no idea. Tens of thousands of years later, a person would kneel down beside them and try to understand who they were. Oregon found the thread. The rest of the field is still pulling on it.